Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I am here with Chris Freiler. Okay, now Chris Freiler, who's been gracious to join me every year for about the past 3 years, he is the author of the AP Achiever Prep Book. Okay, which this is for AP European History, and people ask me all the time, "What prep book do you recommend? Should I buy a prep book?" And I tell people that this book, it is, for its helpfulness, for its integration of the concept outline. It's everything basically put into plain English. You can read this book and it's pretty much an outline of the test, complete with test taking tips. It's even got a couple of it's got some sample tests here that Chris has written about. Now, as far as that goes, who's Chris? What should I care what he thinks? Okay, so Chris has been teaching AP Euro since before you were born. All right, he's been at Hinsdale Central High School in the Chicago area since 1993, and not only teaching AP Euro, but he's served on test development committees. He has been the assistant chief reader, question leader at the AP Reading. So this is a book that is written by a guy who knows what he's talking about. And I've got links to purchase the book. You can either purchase it on Amazon, or you can get it directly from the publisher. And I've got a sample chapter, a link to a sample chapter that is available on my website when you go to the AP Euro 10-week study plan. If you're watching on YouTube, there is a link in the description about the 10-week study plan. Be sure to join the email list so that you can get updates from me. We're going to be prepping together for this exam for the next 9 weeks. We're actually in week 2 of the 10-week study plan, but I won't tell anybody you're late if you don't tell anybody I'm late, okay? So as far as that goes, the chief purpose here, we are going to hear a little bit more about this book, and we are also going to take some questions from AP Euro teachers and students. Now, if the chat room gets boisterous, which it typically does, I'm going to be taking questions through Twitter at Tom Ritchie, okay? So just at my name, feel free to ask any questions you have. I'll be looking to Twitter first to answer questions. And of course, looking for people who, those of you I recognize as people that support my work, of course, will get first priority. But go to Twitter, ask a question, but keep the chat room going and everything like that. Okay, so this book, if you're an AP Euro student, you want to get a hold of this, and we're about to explain why. So I've already introduced Chris, but Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Tom. Well, like you said, I've been involved with the course for quite a while now. I also was on the committee that redesigned the curriculum, and the focus became much more on students making arguments. So that kind of informed the way I approached the book, as I wanted students to know how to integrate writing and thinking of history as an interpretive art rather than simply an accumulation of facts. So I also tried to tie the book very explicitly to the curriculum framework, which is basically the official publication of the College Board. For example, I tried to go through the 6 course themes, explain what those themes entail, and then weave them throughout the book. So I think for students studying, the most important thing they can start with is really the big picture. You don't start on the forest floor gathering leaves and accumulating facts with flashcards. You have to start with what are the major questions, what are the major developments in each one of these 6 themes of the course, and those are subdivided by the key concepts. And then it's important to know what's required content on the test and what's merely examples that are used to illustrate. So I tried to call those out in the book by bolding the terms, people, events, treaties, works of literature that you absolutely need to know, because there could be a question based on them, whether it was multiple choice or short answer or LEQ or even a DBQ. And then underline the examples that are more used for illustrative purposes. And I tried to make the questions, whether those are at the end of the chapters or the comprehensive exams, the 2 at the end of the book, very much tailored to the stimulus-based questions that are on the multiple choice, and make it as realistic as possible to what the exam will really be like for a student.
All right. Well, excellent. Now, Chris, I think one of the best things that we can do is to show people the book. Okay. And I'll tell you, sometimes, I mean, if my tutoring clients have this book, now remember, I offer individual and group tutoring. If you're interested, check out my website. But when somebody has this book, it makes it so much easier for me because it's divided into things that people need to know. And also it separates like the big concepts from illustrative examples. Okay. So it also shows shows you some options that you can use for your LEQ. So Chris, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a sample chapter. Now, this is available on my website. If you're watching on YouTube, click the link for the 10-week study plan, sign up for the email list, and click to download a sample chapter. Now, you'll have to give some information, but then it'll send you to the sample chapter right then. You don't have to wait for it, okay? So this is chapter 5. This is on the so let's see, economic expansion, social change, and religious wars. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, yeah, so we're getting into the age of exploration, which of course is something that is relevant to AP Euro, APUSH, and AP World. So Chris, let me see what I can do here. I don't know, they keep changing the versions of this, but I think we can see enough here. Okay, so Chris, if I'll kind of scroll down as you tell us what's in the book, or you want to bring some attention to something.
Sure. So each chapter, as you might guess, starts with an introduction, which highlights the big ideas, major developments that will be covered in that chapter, and then it identifies the key concepts of that chapter, as you can see right there. And then you'll see on the side, if you scroll down a little bit, there's a couple of features. So this one's called theme music right there, which just draws student attention to how the themes play out through various time periods throughout the course. So in this case, it's really the first introduction to the interaction of Europe and the world theme, because it's obviously exploration, since the course starts in 1450. That's going to be your first topic. So it really just reminds students that this is where you're setting the foundation for what are the questions, what are the issues, what are the effects of interaction between Europe and the world. And then as you continue to scroll down, it takes you through basically the major concepts that define this particular event or process. So you'd start with the means. How did Europeans establish overseas colonies? The motivations, and then it takes you through the ways in which they administer their overseas empires, and then takes you through the effects of that. And,
okay. And I like also, Chris, how you've just basically got, okay, here are some specific pieces of evidence that you might use while you're working through this. Now, one thing I wanted to ask, Chris, is I asked my teacher audience before the hangout, I gave teachers an opportunity to ask you questions, and you mentioned course themes. Okay, so my friend Emily Landers, who teaches AP Euro in Tallahassee, had a question about the course themes. How do the course themes fit into the AP Euro course, Chris?
Well, I think one way to think of the course is if it were like a play. The themes are the conflicts that are woven into the play. So you could, obviously a story or a movie can have one major conflict, but you can also have a lot of subplots. So these are really the plots and the subplots of the course. And I think it's a great way for students to study. So what I would recommend, especially with your 10-week prep course, is for students to really home in on the themes and really lay out from 1450 to 2001, what are the issues, what are the major developments that define this theme. So just taking that one interaction of Europe and the world, just tracing that through from 1450 to 2001, it's going to take a student through exploration, the commercial revolution, the slave trade, the colonial wars, commercial wars among the great powers, overseas powers, and then into the revolutionary period, and then into imperialism, decolonization. So a student should be able to trace that over time, because the questions asked on the exam, especially the long essay questions, often involve students tracing a development over a long period of time.
Okay, got it. And of course, there are other course themes, such as I believe one of them is the individual in society.
Right. So that's one of the, I think, students sometimes find stronger challenges with some of the themes than the other. Most students find the most difficult theme objective knowledge and subjective visions, which is really the intellectual and cultural theme. So even more, it's important that if you struggle with that theme, that you really sit down and try to make sure that you define the important concepts that are woven throughout the course on that theme. Individual and society is basically the way in which institutions have shaped the individual. So it would be topics like family, gender, child rearing, social class, and how those have played a role and maybe even been tied to economic and other developments throughout European history.
Okay, got it, got it. Okay, well, excellent. And so, really, what I'm hearing is, as students review, a lot of times we tend toward kind of a chronological review when we do these things and we prep for these things. But always pay attention each week. Each week, if you're looking at a topic, how does that fit into these course themes? And of course, that's also available in the AP Achiever text. Chris, is there anything else from that sample chapter that you wanted to bring attention to?
Yeah, if you go back to it,
Okay.
project it. And by the way, I think if you want to make it full screen, you can take that little arrow that's right by the scroll bar, and if you click that, it'll go full screen. The little
Okay, let me yeah, let me check. Let's see. It's about to my computer likes to take a little while to share the screen. Okay, so we're good there. And so we've got something that's
So
next to
see the arrow there where it's right by select file, that blue oval in the middle of the right hand bar, like over to the right hand side.
over the right-hand side. Okay.
So see where it says select file all the way down there? Go to the left. You see a little arrow there, but it's just right to the left of select file.
Oh,
Click
got
on
it.
that arrow, it's going to
Oh,
bring it all the way
wow.
over.
Okay. Well, wow. Okay. Well, thanks, Chris, for the computer
Sure,
literacy exercise. That's
no
that was
problem.
that was unexpected. Okay. So
If you scroll down, it'll show you another one of the features. I don't know exactly where it is. Oh, so if you go on the left-hand side, see where it says sample base?
uh-huh.
So here's where I try to show students how they can take some of these uh, underlined samples, which are called illustrative examples. So they're not required, but they're nice ways for students to be able to express their understanding. So this is what I would say to a student. The short answer questions, which I think should be the easiest part of the course, always require a specific example. I think sometimes students talk about a topic or talk about their understanding of something in general terms, and it's really effective if you use one specific example in the SAQ and use that example to show that you understand a concept. So if the question, for example, on this one, where how are European uh, colonizers and explorers able to establish overseas empires, you could maybe use one of these examples here on advances in ship design or navigation. And that would be a useful way to express your understanding. So that's what the example-based feature does there.
Yeah, and what I like about this is we've got words that show up in italics, I believe, and that well, I think there are bold words, Chris, if I'm not mistaken. Those are things that okay, if a word's bold, you need to know this, right?
Yeah, that's required knowledge. And then
Okay.
the underlined terms are not required, but they can be useful to students just in using them, as I said, to make an argument or to make a claim.
Yeah, so when we see these underlined words, this is something that if you're preparing for the exam, Chris mentioned that we could talk about the SAQ, but also on an LEQ. If you're thinking about, I've got to use a specific example to illustrate this. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, and I think that I hear Chris saying the same thing. You don't need to be like, okay, I need to know the compass, the quadrant, the astrolabe, the Latin sail, the portolani, and all of that. But pick one or two of these underlined words and understand that if you get a question about the role of technology in the age of exploration, then there you go. Pick one of these and you've answered your question. And
Right.
so, he's been very helpful here that like anytime you see something underlined, and what I like about this book is that anybody can read it. Okay. Anybody can read it because he's got it set up to where there you go. You see something underlined, you know that that's an illustrative example that you might choose to use to illustrate something. Okay. So the middle passage. Okay. That's something I would use possibly for on this. Now, then we look at this here, the Columbian Exchange. All right. So when we look at the Columbian Exchange, that's in bold. You don't really have the option. That could come up on the multiple choice test. You are supposed to know this. Now, how do we illustrate the Columbian Exchange? Well, we've got all of these different underlined words. So you can use potato. Now, don't try to do all of these because you're going to get them confused. But if you think in terms of, okay, so here are goods that come from the Americas, and then here are goods that are, coming from the old world. So, you can know that, okay, I'll remember horses and pigs from the old world and measles and smallpox. And there you go. Chris, do you have anything to add to that? I think I see skill set here.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah. So two things. On the use of examples, I would just caution students that the purpose of the writing parts, especially the two questions, the longer, more constructed responses that are based on rubrics, the LEQ and the DBQ, it's important that students don't feel like they engage in what I call a data dump, where they just begin to narrate and simply dump out all of the content that they studied. So from these examples here in the Columbian Exchange, it's more important that a student selects several and then actually explain what impact that these new goods and practices had on both Europe and the Americas instead of simply narrating them. My experience with the LEQ, for example, is that let's say a student has 2 paragraphs because the 2 paragraphs correspond to something that the students were asked to do by the question. If you simply have 2 or 3 examples that are well applied to your argument, that is much preferable to having 5 or 6 or more that are simply just a list that you memorized. The skill set part there is one of the other features on the sidebar. And here I basically have taken this major topic of the Columbian Exchange and shown students several ways in which they can take the skills that are required in the course and think about them as a way to construct a response. So we're seeing your email page there. I don't know if that's...
Oh, oops, I'm sorry, Chris. Yeah, I forgot I was projecting. Okay, excellent.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, so, I was looking for another teacher question. I need to do that. Yes, excellent. Okay, we're back.
So yeah, this is just, I was almost done just saying, like, you could compare and contrast the effects of the Columbian Exchange on Europe and the Americas. You could show how this represents a change in continuity over time with Europe's interaction with the rest of the world. And then you could also think about how to develop an argument, like how would 1492 represent a turning point? Although we don't use that term anymore, there'd still be questions that are related to periodization that would just be phrased as, is this represent a significant change in the history of the world, especially Europe's interaction with the rest of the world?
Yeah, so ladies and gentlemen, what I want to bring attention to here is we want to, while he's mentioned that there have been a few changes, okay, which, my 8-month writing clinic's great stuff. Y'all might want to look into that. Okay, so as far as on the 10-week study plan page, where I've got some things here about Chris's book, you can sign up for the email list for some more updates. If you're a student, that there's a sample chapter available here, but also a 2017 update memo. So we want to make sure to make that clear. Okay, so Chris, why is it important that a student who buys your book would also take a look at this update memo?
Sure. So in the summer of 2017, some further changes were added to the curriculum framework, including a reorganization of the skills. So the book as it is I hope still very helpful to students, but there was a new theme added. So I explained what that new theme is, and there was a reorganization and a new phrasing added to the skills. So I break that down. And also there were a few small but still noticeable changes made to the actual concept outline, which is the sort of organized Roman numeral of essentially what is required content for the course. So there are a few minor changes there. And there you see the two rubrics for the LEQ and the DBQ if you continue to go down there.
Okay, and so yeah, Chris has got this all broken down graphically. And the thing is, I want to make sure that we make that clear that they did make some minor changes to the exam in 2017 for last year's exam. It was not a redesign of the exam. Okay, so when I'm telling people like, hey, this is my favorite book to review for the test, it's got a little explanation of a few changes that have happened since then, but it's not like the course has changed significantly, and this is still, I think I'm still using it. Okay, I'm still using it for myself, and I think it's a great book. And if we were to change books every time the College Board decides, like, hey, let's tweak this test a little bit, we'd be doing nothing but writing new books. So make sure that when you do purchase Chris's book, look at that insert, because there are some things which, I still talk about turning points in my class all the time, because if we're doing a continuity and change over time essay, Chris, if I'm seeing this right, a turning point would go in there somewhere.
Sure. It's just the phrase turning point. I think they're trying to avoid using that phrase to drive a question, but it's the same idea. If you say, does World War I, for example, represent a significant change in European diplomacy and politics? That's basically another way of saying, is 1914 a turning point in European history? And if a student approached it that way, or even used the word turning point in their response, they would be just fine. It's just that the College Board, I think, is not going to be using that phrase organize a question.
Yeah, so it's not organizing the question, but we would still use that. We could still use that phrase when answering the question, explain
Absolutely.
continuity and change over time. That, over here, World War I's a major turning point. So yeah, the same skills are still useful. It's just, as Stephen Mercado says, answer the freaking question or whatever, right? Just answer the
APFQ.
question. And these skills are still going to be useful for you. Now, speaking of 1914, Chris, 1914 is the beginning of the so-called period 4. And my friend Tara Cox, a teacher at Dutchtown High School, is asking, what advice do you have getting through the so-called period 4? Like, as far as that goes, that a lot of teachers are really struggling to get through the content because we have to get, we're trying to get through everything. We're supposed to also teach kids how to figure out stimulus-based multiple choice questions and SAQs and the DBQ and the LEQ. And so what do you recommend to teachers who are in a situation where they feel like they're really struggling to get through all the content?
Yeah, this is the time of year where people are realizing they have to play some catch up. And it's always good to have some time for the reviewing for the exam. So I would say try to catch up really fast. Maybe take one topic and really condense it down to like a day or two. Maybe do a forum where students are required to formulate an argument about the entire period or the entire topic, or just really decide what are the most essential questions. I would actually combine skills with content. So let's say your students need some practice on multiple choice. Maybe have them do a reading on, let's say you want to do the causes of World War I. So have them do a background reading, and then basically just like maybe spend 20 minutes in the period having them answer several sets of multiple choice questions and use the multiple choice questions as the basis for a discussion. And then, that covers basically one of the most important parts of that era, which is causes, and then maybe do a day on the nature of the war and total war. Maybe do one on the impact in the Treaty of Versailles, and then maybe do one on the causes of the Russian Revolution, and then another one on the course and the outcomes of the Russian Revolution. So basically, if you could do maybe 5 days on World War I and the Russian Revolution, hopefully that would get you caught up rather than taking each unit and just keep cutting off like 20 or 30%. Pick a unit that's maybe is not as much interest to you, or where you really think you can pick up some time.
Yeah, and I, of course, I tell teachers the same thing a lot of times, since everything's pretty much got, I mean, as long as we think, okay, those periods have equal weight, and this topic is as important as this topic, as a teacher, I would spend more time on what I find myself interested in, because my students are going to get into more of that too when they see enthusiasm. So sometimes, I mean, it's okay to tell students like, hey, take a look at your AP Achiever, your textbook, and let's just kind of work out this topic that may not be the most interesting thing to do in class. So, the biggest thing too, I find that these exams, especially the redesigned exam, I found that the old exam with 80 multiple choice questions tended to be more comprehensive, whereas this one's just kind of like Russian roulette. Like, it'll test some things won't quite make it, and at the end of the day. But yeah, I think good advice there for Tara. And let me take a look, Emily, during our Fiveable reviews. Now, those of you who are watching, if you haven't been to the Fiveable reviews, we do this every week. It's at fiveable.me. Make sure you join us. Now, Chris was mentioning modernism. We're going to be looking at that during tomorrow's review, modern philosophy and modern art. Okay, and Chris, what about the role of individuals in history? And I think this is actually, I feel like I could answer this question using AP Achiever, but how much attention should we be devoting to individuals, especially as teachers?
Well, I mean, it's really a combination. The course emphasizes, more impersonal themes like the development of capitalism, or centralizing tendencies in the state. But certainly there are crucial moments in history where individuals make a huge impact. And so I would just, again, go to the course and exam description, which is, for lack of a better term, known as the yellow book by my students. And essentially go through that book, and it'll identify who are the individuals that students need to know. For example, there's a whole Roman numeral on Napoleon. I think if you really want to understand the French Revolution, you want to understand mass politics, warfare, balance of power in the 19th century, I think you really do need to understand someone like Napoleon. But if you take a topic like, let's say, the scientific revolution, I would not turn that into simply a parade of scientists. There are some that are called out in the framework. For example, Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, Harvey, Bacon and Descartes for the scientific method. But after that, really the other ones are there for you, for students and teachers to use as examples to show that they understand the new approaches of the scientific revolution. So it's always a balance. I think what students get in trouble when they forget balance, when they become too general and too vague, or when they become mired in specific minutiae. It's the connection between the important understandings with selected examples.
Okay, and the thing is, Chris, if it's okay with you, I'm going to plug your book a little bit here, but because I'm looking here at the, I'm in chapter 9 on the Enlightenment, and there are things like, if I look here on 145, I see neoclassicism, which is bolded, and then I see Jacques-Louis David underlined. So what I see here, when I see Jacques-Louis David underlined, I'm not going to need him for a multiple choice question, but if I have a question that I'm answering about the French Revolution or Napoleon or the Enlightenment, anything that I can tie in with neoclassical art, then Jacques-Louis David would be a great example. And then when we look into the Enlightenment here, I see that Denis Diderot, he is bolded. Voltaire is bolded. Adam Smith is bolded. Next to Adam Smith, we've got the physiocrats underlined. So it would be helpful for a student to be able to know the association between Adam Smith and the physiocrats, but not strictly necessary. David Hume, somebody that if you're a scholar of the Enlightenment, would be a great person to know. Essential if you're taking a survey course in modern European history, you probably don't have to know who David Hume is. I think, gosh, I've got one here, and I've read, you read about 5 pages of Hume, and it's just like, wow, this guy's pretty dense. So what he's done here is, then he's got skepticism here, where he's noting that in bold. You don't necessarily have to associate that with Hume. So what I like about this book is, Chris has basically done all the work for you as far as which individual, I don't know if it's about teaching individuals, but knowing which individuals are most likely to show up on the exam. And there you go. It's right there. I mean, even if you're a teacher watching, I just find having a copy of this book for myself, even if my students don't have it, then, it's really helpful because it just puts everything right there for you. You have anything to add to that, Chris? Or
no, I think you nailed it. So usually when you study a topic, there's going to be 3 or 4 people that are essential to that topic, but it's just a matter of, like, again, using those individuals to illustrate the development. So in the Enlightenment would be, the developments of, like, let's say, new religious approaches. So obviously Diderot would represent atheism, and let's say you wanted to talk more about agnosticism or just a general skepticism, he would be a perfect example. So it's like, what does this example do for me? So the example should always be doing work for you rather than just kind of laying flat on the page. Like, I'm going to drop some names, and I'm just going to drop out Hume because, my teacher told me that I need to know this person, or because it was in the textbook. I always think about, like, why is Hume relevant? What does he tell us about the Enlightenment?
And that's something Chris has hit on a couple times tonight, is that it does you absolutely no good to go into the Bubba Gump thing. I think some high schoolers have seen Forrest Gump, where he's just like fried shrimp cocktail, shrimp Creole,
right, sure.
And he just starts naming off all these ways to do shrimp, and that's not going to get you any points. That there has to be some type of description, okay? Like if you think about it as a dictionary, to get that first evidence point, you at least need to understand what this is. So it's like, Denis Diderot, which Denny Diderot, whatever, but it's written test, right? But the thing is, and that's another thing. I mean, if you're studying for this test, if you think about it the way it looks, I had a college professor who always said, like, he said Louis the 14th, and we kind of laugh at him, but I think he just decided, like, look, I give up on trying to get people to pronounce these things right, and the tests are written. But as far as that goes, if you're thinking about Diderot, then you would need to know that he was an Enlightenment philosopher who collaborated on the encyclopedia. And if you have some, you need to actually know what, the encyclopedia is a compendium of knowledge that is not controlled by the authorities, not controlled by the church, not controlled by the government, and that sort of thing. So you're going to need to, and as Chris said, and this is how I've been training students to write, that if you think about your typical LEQ essay, your typical LEQ is going to have 2 or 3 body paragraphs. I'd say 3 body paragraphs if you're going for complex understanding. And for each paragraph, just to have 2 or 3 well-developed pieces of evidence rather than somebody, doing what he calls the data dump. Or I kind of think of somebody just walking up with a shotgun and just shooting whatever comes out. And that's not going to help you. So, make your point, give a couple of examples, and then really develop those things. Now, Emily had one more question. She's always good with questions. Chris, do you want to venture any guesses on the DBQ topic this year?
No, I'll say it has 7 documents, and one of them will be a visual. But other than that, I think given the fact that you only need one evidence beyond the document, I think most students should be able. I think for my students, what often happens is that they kind of forget that point. So it's more important that you take the time and practice taking that 15 minutes where you're organizing your response and making sure you're actually hitting the rubric. I think it's important to remind students and to teachers to remind them is that you're writing toward a rubric. And so having like repeated practice with the DBQ, I think is more important than I think probably trying to guess what it is.
Okay, and actually, Chris, that's what I'm glad you answered that for me. But yeah, a lot of times there is gaming it. But I tell my students, like, even if you know something, or if you know nothing about it, you're probably not going to get contextualization or evidence beyond the documents or complex understanding. That's it. That's assuming you know nothing. So even if somebody put a DBQ in front of me that I knew nothing about, I can score 4 points. I could make a thesis. I could use the documents to make an argument. It's all there. I can go into point of view analysis. And so there's really no reason somebody can't score for, get the thesis statement and then those 3 points that have to do with the document. So focusing on the format rather than the topic. Now, Chris, I've got a question on Twitter. I want to take a few questions from students. Why? Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, yeah, we won't go into that Twitter handle. But this person has a question about Italian unification and who you think is the most important figure in Italian unification. So anything you've got to offer this at YX Nuts or whatever this Twitter user, then that's great.
Well, that's an easy one. It's Cavour. Because Cavour represents that new approach toward politics, the new breed of politician after the failed revolutions of 1848, and his wily diplomacy and his understanding that national unity requires economic and infrastructure to bind the people together rather than merely slogans. So obviously Mazzini, Garibaldi, and others helped set the stage for that. I mean, Garibaldi played an actual military role, but it's really Cavour, I think, who's the driving force and would be the parallel to Bismarck. And I think if you can understand those 2 figures and then understand the background, like why did this new type of leadership emerge during this period after 1850, I think the student would be in a good position to really explain and understand Italian unification, which is really more important than just giving a narrative of here's every step of the way. If you understand the historical context and use a couple of examples, you're in much better shape.
Okay, well, Chris, to follow up on that, because you mentioned Garibaldi, for example, and when he was, which you even said Mazzini, I get lazy and say Mazzini, so Mazzini, which when he was with Mazzini and they take Rome in 1848, that didn't do much for him. So until Cavour got involved, there was really no political organization of this. Let's think about kind of the bigger question here, and I think that can kind of address some of these exam-focused kind of argument-driven things. Chris, what would you do if you were asked to make a comparison, between Italian unification and German unification, going into a few similarities and differences?
Sure. I think what's good to notice, and I think teachers can help out, is how the exam questions have been phrased recently. So there's 3 targeted historical thinking skills that could be asked on the LEQ. So that's change in continuity over time, causation, and comparison. So usually what they'll do is ask you one part of that. Usually like for example, if you take yours, Italian and German unification, they probably ask you to contrast the 2 of them. So you could actually earn that complexity point by doing a comparison. So I think the comparison would be both of the leaders clearly are practitioners of realpolitik, although that's a German word, but I mean, basically whatever the Italian equivalent would be. And then using diplomacy, warfare, and internal like economic and improvements to like build a more coherent polity within. And then the contrast, I think, would be Cavour is much more reliant on outside diplomatic help and support, in this case from Napoleon III of France, whereas Bismarck was able to accomplish this because Prussia's obviously was a stronger military and be able to do that without necessarily counting on or relying on outside military help.
Okay, and yes, Chris, as we said with the with the phrasing, it'll say something like evaluate the extent to which Italian unification and German unification differed from each other. And of course, with the complexity, we make this nuanced argument that we're not just saying that they're different and how they're different, but they were mostly similar, but here is a difference that we can see here. And of course, Chris, now I know this for APUSH. I know at the APUSH reading, even if the prompt was targeted at comparison, the thinking, the historical reasoning point was given for any of the thinking skills that was demonstrated. Was that the same at the AP Euro reading last year?
Yeah, I wasn't on the LEQ, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But I think the idea there, like you just said, is that the student is actually doing some historical reasoning rather than merely narrating what happened.
Okay, so the thing is, if you got a question about Italian unification, German unification, if somebody explored like this turning point of the failed revolutions of 1848 and demonstrated how, even though they're comparing, but they're also demonstrating how these changed over time, and of course, kind of emphasizing how the revolutions of 18, and then of course you get into causation as well. So we can go, it's definitely easiest to do what they're telling you, right? If they're saying that compare Italian and German unification, you want to focus on that, but there are also ways that you can kind of weave in these other skills. And from what I was talking to with, hearing from APUSH readers, if any of those three thinking skills was present, then they get that point. So yeah, you weren't on the LEQ, but you've heard similar things.
Yeah, I would probably save those additional skills like the ones you just mentioned for the complexity point. I would certainly encourage students to try to answer the question that was asked. So if they're asking for like similarities and differences, I would explore that. But if the student wants to bring in a turning point, maybe in the conclusion as part of their attempt at demonstrating a complex thesis, I think that's a good idea to just know what the skills are and how you can apply them.
Yeah, and that's one thing I've been emphasizing this year, Chris, with my students is for the LEQ, it's so easy to write a 3-point LEQ, thesis, a few relevant examples and targeting the thinking skill. Now, those other 3 points can get a lot more difficult to earn. Like the effort that's spent to write like a 4 essay versus a 6 essay is so much different. But yeah, when we're going for the complexity point, we'll definitely weave some other things in. So we've got a little Italian unification there. And let's see here. Okay, so I've got a question from Abs, okay, from @Abby_Ant. A question about totalitarianism, okay? So to what extent was, let's kind of narrow her question down. To what extent could fascist Italy, for example, be considered a totalitarian state?
Yeah, I think that's a plant. I think that's my student who's attempting to get me to do her homework assignment for her.
Well, the exact question, Chris, is what is the extent that totalitarianism was present in the USSR under Stalin, Nazi Germany under Hitler, or Italy under Mussolini? Does that sound like your prompt?
Yeah, well, it's a forum. It's a totalitarianism forum, and each group of students was assigned one of those 3 totalitarian regimes, and they have to use some evidence to argue that their assigned regime was the strongest fulfillment of totalitarianism. So
okay, got it. Well, I'm certainly glad to hear some of your students are in touch with me on Twitter, perhaps. So let's think about Italy, like what because that's something that is typically discussed. It's like Mussolini is kind of brought in here, but to what extent would you? I mean, now if you don't want to leave that alone, get through their homework.
So I would say I think most historians would say that was the weakest of the totalitarian states. And that Mussolini was never able to exercise the same degree of control over the hearts and minds of Italy. I mean, just take, for example, Italy, though being allied with Nazi Germany, saved almost all of its Jews. And Italians never really adopted the anti-Semitism that Mussolini kind of half-heartedly promoted because he wanted to strengthen his alliance with Hitler. And the very fact that, unlike Hitler, who committed suicide, or Stalin, who died a natural death, Mussolini was, dragged through the streets and hung up along with his mistress. So I think that probably pretty clearly indicates that by the end of the war, many Italians felt that they shouldn't have been involved in basically what was Hitler's conflict. I actually think the Soviet Union under Stalin had the strongest totalitarian system, because I mean, we're still living with the effects of that today in Russia, whereas Nazi Germany basically has repudiated the entire Nazi system except for a few, old holdouts. But I think, the after effects of each one of these regimes probably also gives us a pretty good indication of how totalitarian they were.
Okay, that is an interesting take, Chris, thinking about the method of death that, at least Hitler had to shoot himself and then Stalin died of natural call. Okay, yeah, that's definitely something to think about there. Now also, I guess when you look at the relationship between Italy and the Catholic Church as well, that would have been a factor too, right?
Yeah, I mean, Hitler and Mussolini both signed agreements with the Catholic Church to gain some legitimacy, and also for each institution to kind of carve out its own place of autonomy. I mean, it's just like Napoleon's Concordat as well. I think there were tensions in the relationship that at first each side had an interest in signing an agreement so they could, maintain in the interest of the state, not having interference from the church, and for the church's perspective, not having interference from the state. But I still think there were conflicts between the church and Mussolini. There certainly wasn't necessarily outright rebellion, but there were individual priests and bishops who, like I just mentioned before, helped rescue Jews and shield them from the designs of the fascist regime.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I've actually been watching The Man in the High Castle on Amazon,
Oh
and
yeah,
that's
good
and
stuff.
that's got like the Japanese imperial government is kind of half-heartedly pursuing anti-Semitism in order to placate the Nazis, but not necessarily wholeheartedly. So that's interesting that's kind of got a bit of a somewhat of a parallel in Italy at that time. So Chris, what about, let's see. Okay, yeah, we've got another homework doer here. As far as I think somebody got assigned the 2017 DBQ on the English Bill of Rights and the Enlightenment. Chris, I think this may be a good question rather than addressing that particular prompt. What advice do you have for, like, just a word of advice for a student that's writing a DBQ?
Well, like I said before, I would just practice and make sure you know the rubric. It's not enough to just write well and put together, persuasive rhetoric. You actually have to think about, what are my strategies for meeting the 7 points of the rubric. I would also just try to start out very clear and make sure that your thesis takes a position. I mean, that's the first thing the reader will look for, other than that contextualization. So the way I put it is, after a reader is done with your intro paragraph, you should have 2 points already. You should have your contextualization point, 2 or 3 sentences of background that helps set up your thesis. Think of it as like a funnel. You start broad and you narrow it down to like what helps set up my argument. And then I would just start strong in the first paragraph. Nice topic sentence. How does this paragraph advance my argument? And then my first document, I try to pick one that really shows off that I'm going to be analyzing documents in this essay that allow me to show the subtleties and complexities, and try to start out with a source analysis. Do a historical context, or talk about the possibility of a bias or the reliability of the source, and try not to spend too much time on any one document. And then use transitions to show how the documents relate to each other. Does this document contradict the perspective of the previous document? Does it support it? And use those kinds of transitions to indicate that you're not simply going one by one, narrating and summarizing the documents, but you're using them to make an argument. So I think for a lot of students, they forget what their argument is, and then they forget to develop it and deepen it and make it more complex by engaging with the 7 sources they're provided.
And that's one thing we've heard a lot from Chris tonight, is that this exam is the writing is argument driven. So anything that you were mentioning should serve an argument, that it's not so much about showing how much you know, but a person who knows a moderate amount but can apply it really well to an argument. I mean, I'm finding, Chris, that we've really become like teachers of rhetoric as much as anything. As far as this exam. And I mean, I don't necessarily see a problem with that. Now, Chris, speaking of the DBQ, it looks like there is a DBQ that you wrote that's in the AP Achiever text. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, we've got, the directions have changed a little bit. So you want to make sure you're using the most recent rubric, but this still has 7 documents. And it can, as far as that goes, it's something that you could pretty much do this DBQ, and it would prepare you for that. Now, would you mess with the prompt here or anything like that if you were writing this yourself?
Sure. So actually, there's two DBQs.
Okay.
There's two practice tests. Each one has a DBQ. And there's also a DBQ as a sample in the strategy section. So there's 3 DBQs. And frankly, if a student gets the electronic version, there's actually 4 diagnostic tests, one after each period, each one that includes a DBQ. So there's several So the one I think that you're referring to is the comparing and contrasting the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. Is that what you were looking at there?
Yes, that's what I'm looking at here. Yeah.
So I would probably just phrase it as contrast or evaluate the extent to which the Enlightenment and the Romantic period had differing views of human nature and reason. That's probably what I would do, or nature and human reason. And then just the students could then make an argument about whether they were more similar or more different.
Okay, and that's one thing that I've noticed on the DBQ. Like somebody was asking me online here. Let's see, Aaron was asking about like the differentiation between a 5 and a 6 on the LEQ, and then the same thing would work for a 6 and a 7 on the DBQ. The complex understanding point. That a big part of that is, as Chris said, is not just saying how something, it's like evaluating the extent, or if we have to say it's this or this, making sure that you're putting a hierarchy. So, for example, last year the prompt was, evaluate the, whether the 30 Years' War was primarily religious or primarily political. And so you can get complex understanding by noting, that it was both religious and political. But one of the caveats here is to be able to really show complex understanding, you had to say, which one is it? Okay, was it more religious and then also a bit political, or was it more political but also a bit religious? So you want to make sure that when you are evaluating that you're ranking things. Okay, so this argument is more credible than that argument.
Yeah, so I would say think of it as like a debate. So if you were to be watching a debate and maybe you actually had 2 historians debating, maybe one of them sincerely believes it was primarily religion that motivated the conflict, and another one believes it was primarily political or territorial interest, is just imagine that you're, reporting on you have to take a position, but you're reporting on the arguments of both sides. So you're actually answering, you're anticipating a counterclaim to your position. So one book that I would just point out, teachers especially might be interested, it's called They Say, I Say. And it basically is an exercise in persuasion and rhetoric. You can apply it to any subject area. But one of the things featured there is what's called the 4-sentence argument template. So it might be something like, some historians would argue that the French Revolution is the most important turning point in European history. I would respond by saying the First World War is the most important turning point in European history. They would respond by saying the French Revolution provided the most significant change in politics by attacking the old regime. I would respond by saying the old regime was really dealt a death blow by the First World War because it continued to persist after the French Revolution. So then if I was using documents, I would take the documents provided for me and not necessarily go back and forth wishy-washy, but use the opposing position as a way for me to re-articulate my position, but re-engaging with those arguments that don't agree with it, or the evidence from the documents that don't agree with it.
Yes, and then of course also there's kind of the qualifying element as well, when we say that we part of, and it's a debating tactic as well. Sometimes note that there is some merit to this other point, but then as Chris said, turn it back to your thing, but it's still not as credible as this point that I'm making, and here's why. All right, so Chris, do you have any last minute advice? I think a few people have asked questions on Twitter, but I think I've gone through those. If there's any kind of last advice before I plug this book one more time.
Oh yeah, I think this is the time of year where students are maybe thinking about studying for the exam. So we're actually less than 2 months out, and I think this is why you have your 10-week study plan. Is it's best to break it down into manageable chunks rather than doing a cram session 2 or 3 nights before. And I would just say, like I mentioned before, is really focus in on chronology. It's important that especially students maybe know some important dates and then centuries or eras, and be able to define the most important characteristics of those eras. And when you get a prompt, an LEQ, that asks you to, let's say, for example, analyze economic developments and changes between, let's say, 1650 and 1789, you're really probably dealing with a question there about the commercial revolution, the growth in commerce. And if you don't know that right off the bat because you haven't studied that way, that's going to be really difficult for you to understand that question, because what I've noticed in my experience at the AP reading is the number one reason why students do poorly is not because they don't know anything. It's because they don't know what content that they've studied is actually relevant to the question, because they're not able to situate themselves accurately in the chronology. So if you just take more time to take a kind of zoom back and make sure that you understand the big picture chronologically, that's probably one of the best things that you can do to make sure you're making the most effective use of what it is that you studied in the year and what content you actually know.
Well, and I find that's actually a big thing on the multiple choice as well, because on the multiple choice, a lot of times, at least one of the distractors is going to be 100 years removed from the question.
Right.
And so if you know, you have that chronology and start off with the four, the four periods. And as Chris said, knowing some dates. Okay. Now I wouldn't, you probably don't need to know more than about, 10 or 15 years going into it, but things like 1453, the fall of Constantinople. Then you think about 1517 for the Reformation. 1648 is one of those period dividing years. So if we think about 1648, 1815, 1914, okay, the end of the Reformation era, the end of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and then, of course, the beginning of World War I. And, if you don't know anything else, if you can at least go in with those three dates and figure out, hey, I can at least divide this course into four parts, if you can get it more complicated than that, great. But yes, the going and sorting things in and knowing what's happening when and what's going on, very important. Now, let me go ahead, ladies. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so since you're going to come back to the book, one thing that is, I think, different from my review book from some of the other ones I've seen is it has 3 chronological appendices. So the first one is historical eras. The second one are actual historical dates. And then the third one is a much more developed timeline chronology that's based on the 6 themes. And so I think of a student, and so my students, for example, will have to memorize those dates in the first 2 appendices. And just based on their feedback, they've told me that that was one of the most useful exercises that they had to do in preparation for the AP exam. Yeah, those 2 pages.
Okay,
right
so yeah, I mean, Chris has gone through. I mean, he's really done a lot of this hard work for you, and for what I mean, I think it's an incredible value when you think about the appendices, you think about the experience Chris is bringing to the table, and also that you've got the practice items. I mean, this sort of thing here. That when you think about that, there are 2 complete practice tests in this book that you're getting for less than $30. It's an incredible value. It's an incredible value. And so with that, let me just remind you, and as Chris said here, now they are actually, this isn't a concern of yours if you're taking it this year. Now, if you're a teacher, you want to keep in mind that they are doing some minor reorganization. And what I like about what they did, which it kind of plays right into my hand, I don't think they meant to do that, but they're going to be dividing content into like 9 different units. And so the whole premise of the 10-week study plan is that I am going through a lot of these things, and this is actually mirroring how they're going to be organizing the content next year into 9 different units. And so each week, now last week was the Renaissance, so pay a little attention to that. My Romulus app can help you out a little bit. And so week 2, we're starting week 2 now, the Reformation. Now, you don't have to necessarily watch all of these videos. If I were in your position, I'd maybe, if there's something, hey, I could brush up on that. Or I'm going to look in my AP Achiever, or I'm going to go to Albert.io or Quizlet, and I'm going to do some multiple choice. Then week 3, absolutism and constitutionalism. Week 4, you're going to get into the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And then week 5, the French Revolution, Napoleon. So as I update this, I'll be putting weeks 6 through 10 out pretty soon. Make sure to subscribe to my AP Euro students email list. You can buy AP Achiever on Amazon. There is also a link to buy directly from the publisher. If you're watching on YouTube, you can go to McGraw-Hill.com. Amazon says that it's temporarily out of stock. Now, if it were me, I would just go, if you like using Amazon, go ahead and order it. See what kind of luck you have. I've known people in the past that have purchased it and it said it was out of stock and then they ended up getting it. Now, if you order it, you don't get it in a week or two, cancel the order, go to McGraw-Hill.com. Of course, you can also go there with, you know, just to go there. So if I put in here, Chris Freiler, AP Achiever. Okay, I've got my caps lock on there for whatever reason. Okay, the first link that's going to come up here. Okay, of course, then you've got these hangouts that Chris and I have been doing for the past 3 years. But it's the first link on Google. Okay, so you can go here and you can purchase a book directly from the publisher. Okay, so that's another option. If you want to take a look here, the sample chapter that I was showing off earlier is available at McGraw-Hill.com. So you just put that information there, and then you'll get the sample chapter in your email, Chris, I believe immediately.
Yeah, it's not even an email. It's just a PDF that pops up.
Oh, that's going to pop up. Okay, so as soon as you fill that out, a PDF will pop up with a complete sample chapter. Now, remember, after you purchase AP Achiever, then you want to take a look at the 2017 update memo, which puts this into perspective as far as what's changed. And even though a few things have been changed on the exam, Chris makes it very clear what has changed here. And note here that for the most part, Chris is like when we want to see how much did this change, more than anything, we're seeing no change, no change, no change. So it's not a lot of changes, but Chris goes in here and lets you know exactly what has changed since the last publication of this book. And like I said, it's really almost impossible to, to keep up with some of these things at the rate they're changing. So make sure, remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you're a student preparing for the AP Euro exam, subscribe to my AP Euro email list and you'll get some things. Now, another thing, Chris is talking about the periods, okay? So I've got a little handout here on this page where, I've kind of gone in there and thought about some different things that I'm like, okay, what about this time? What about this time? I've got another one that's a little bit newer that I should, my Europe then, Europe now handout. So it kind of goes into some of these thematics. I'll probably clean these up a little bit. When I do, I'll let y'all know. But thinking about what was Europe like in 1450? What was it like in 1815? And what is it like in the present day? And how do we see some of these things progressing? For example, from aristocratic monarchies to limited suffrage to, of course, today, the norm in Europe being parliamentary democracies. Then looking at religion, secularism, looking at, gender roles, and of course, going from feudalism to nationalism to the present day European integration. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, remember to get a hold of this book. I strongly encourage it. I use it myself, okay? I never promote products that I don't use. Like when I talk about AP Achiever, when I talk about Albert IO, these are things that I personally use, and, I don't get paid, I'm not under contract to promote anything or anything like that. I just think it'd be useful. Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, and good luck to all the students and teachers on the preparation for the AP exam.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, remember, keep in touch, get on the email list if you haven't already, and we will be preparing over the next 9 weeks or so, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It's always a pleasure.